meeting is being recorded.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the UWC Research Week, where we are celebrating the UWC contribution to the SDG 2030 agenda. And today, of course, specifically, we will be celebrating the law faculty's contribution to the SDG agenda. A couple of things for housekeeping, as they always call it. Please note that we've had a change in the program. We will have Professor Jonathan Fessha going first, and we will have Professor Ebenezer Durojaye going last on the program. I do request my speakers to please keep to their time. As a general indication, we will have Professor Jonathan Fessha doing his speech, and then we will have a couple of questions for him as he needs to leave the session. Then we'll take the other speakers and we will deal with all of the questions directed to them at the end of the session. 4 questions, please. You are, of course, all invited to ask your questions, but please put those in the Q&A box. Please not in the chat. Please put your questions in the Q&A box. We will be taking all our questions from there. When you do type in your question, please make sure that you direct it at a specific speaker, so that we do need to know, because we need to know who has to field your question and respond to you. Are we ready to start with Professor Fessha? Thank you very much. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you my colleague, Professor Jonathan Fessha, from the law faculty, the holder of the UWC Research Chair on Constitutional Design for Divided Societies. His focus is on examining the relevance of constitutional design in dealing with the challenges of divided societies, something South Africa, unfortunately, of course, is very familiar with. He is a very widely published author on topics related to federalism, constitutional design, intergovernmental relations, and politicized ethnicity. He has included there, for your inconvenience, a number of high-profile publications. He's been asked to contribute to constitution building efforts in a number of states, including Sudan, South Sudan, and Yemen. He was a recipient of the Marie Curie Fellowship and is a Michigan Grotius Research Scholar. Our very eminent colleague, Professor Jonathan Fessha.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the kind words, Ricky. So my presentation today focuses on ethnicity and boundary demarcation, local boundary demarcation. Now, the Vuwani, which is a small city, a small community in the province of Limpopo, made it to the headlines around 2016. And it made it to the headlines because it was engulfed by violent protests. And it was protests that resulted in a devastating destruction of public infrastructure. And it was reported that only in one night only, there were 23 schools that were burned down. And in total, more than 30 schools were burned down. And that violence continued intermittently between 2016 and 2019. Now, at the center of the protests was the decision of the Municipal Demarcation Board to move Vuwani as I said, a small community which is inhabited by people that belong to the Venda ethnic group, and incorporate them into this new municipality called the Collins Chaban municipality, which is numerically dominated by communities that belong to the Zonga ethnic community. So the protests, the reason why the protest took place was that members of the Vuwani community did not want to be incorporated into the new Collins Chabani municipality that's dominated by the Zonga speaking people. So instead, they prefer to remain under the jurisdiction of the Makado municipality, which is dominated by the Venda speaking community. So this situation brings to force or brought to force questions around the relevance of ethnicity in boundary demarcation. Should ethnicity play a role in the demarcation of local boundaries? So that's the question of my paper and also the presentation that I'm making today. So let me start with a bit of history of the boundary making in South Africa. As you all know, the act of demarcating boundaries does not have a pleasant history. Boundary making was part of the series of instruments that the apartheid government used to divide the population, to disadvantage the Black majority while advantaging the white minority. Of course, for much of the period between 1948 and 1994, South Africa's experimentation with decentralization focused on using or demarcating jurisdictions on the basis of race rather than on the basis of functional linkage, rather than on the basis of effectiveness or administrative convenience. But of course, race was not the only fault line that was used to divide the population. Ethnicity was also used to divide the population, especially the Black population. And of course, at the center of that was the Black Homelands Act, famously known as the Bantustanization policy, which assigned different communities to particular territories in South Africa, but also sort of declaring them independent, something which was not accepted by any other country except South Africa itself. So we have this very unpleasant history of boundary making, and probably it's that history of abusing boundary making for partisan purposes that convinced the drafters of the Constitution to agree on the establishment of an independent institution that is responsible for the demarcation of boundaries. So in section 155(3)(b) of the Constitution, we can see that the Constitution envisages the adoption of an act that will establish an independent body that will be responsible for demarcating boundaries. So that was realized when the Municipal Demarcation Board Act, the Municipal Demarcation Act was adopted, and that Municipal Demarcation Act saw the establishment of the Municipal Demarcation Board. Now, this is the board that has the power to determine and also to redetermine municipal boundaries in South Africa. Now, the Act provides the procedure that must be used when demarcating boundaries, but it also outlines the criteria that must be taken into account when demarcating boundaries. And that's listed, for example, in section 24 of the Municipal Demarcation Act. Now, if you look at section 24 of the Municipal Demarcation Act, you can see that a number of factors must be taken into account when demarcating municipal boundaries. For example, administrative convenience features strongly in the equation that determines municipal boundaries, because the Section 24 makes reference to the need for coordinated municipal, provincial, and national programs and services. It also refers to the interdependence of people, the need for cohesive, integrated, and unfragmented areas. It also reflects, it also requires that we need to take into account the need to rationalize the total number of municipalities within different categories to achieve the objectives of effective and sustainable service delivery. So administrative convenience is one of the factors that must be taken into account. But Section 24 also requires us to take into account, requires the demarcation board to take into account finance and capacity considerations. These are considerations that are given strong attention. So Section 24, for example, refers to the financial viability and administrative capacity of the municipality to perform municipal functions effectively and efficiently. The need to share and redistribute financial and administrative resources. So finance and capacity must be considered. In addition, geographical convenience must also be taken into account. For example, the Act makes reference to the need to take into account topographical, environmental, and physical characteristics of the area. And of course, finally, municipal demarcation must not ignore the existing boundaries and the existing land use, social and economic transport planning. So from Section 24, so we see that a number of factors must be taken into account, but it's not clear if it's possible to ensure all of these factors, to ensure that all of these factors are taken into account, or if we need to comply with all these factors. But something is clear, and what is clear is that the efficiency and effectiveness of municipalities seems to dominate the factors that must guide municipal demarcation. So functional criteria is what Section 24 has in mind. So functional linkage dominate the factors that determine municipal boundaries. What is also clear is that communal boundaries do not feature among the factors that must be taken into account. So factors like ethnicity do not feature among the factors that must be taken into account. So municipal demarcation board have often justified its decisions by making reference to functional arguments related to finance, capacity considerations, and administrative convenience. But functional arguments were not only used by the government and the demarcating body to justify the determination or redetermination of local boundaries. Even communities have relied on the same arguments to challenge the decision of a board to determine or redetermine municipal boundaries. South Africa has seen a number of municipal mergers, and has seen transfer of municipalities from one province to another province, the splitting of municipalities. But in all these cases, what comes out clear that there were oppositions to some of the decisions made by the municipal demarcation board, and they were often violent protests against those decisions. But all the protests were based on or articulated in terms of service delivery concerns. So the functional argument were not only used by the board, but also they were used by the members of the community to challenge decisions made by the board. So for example, in 2013, the Municipal Demarcation Board proposed the merger of two municipalities in the province of the Free State. Now, one of the municipalities was not happy with the merger. It didn't want to merge with the other municipality. And the reason was that they felt that the other municipality is poorer, suffers from maladministration, and would only benefit from their municipal resources without contributing anything to the community, to the new municipality. So they rejected or protested the decision of the board based on functional criteria. At some point in South Africa, there used to be municipalities that straddle boundaries, provincial boundaries, which we call them cross-boundary municipalities. And at some point, a decision was made to abolish cross-boundary municipalities and to demarcate exclusively each municipality within a particular provincial jurisdiction. And that would, of course, involve boundary changes. And that was not received well in some of the municipalities. So, for example, I think there are famous cases involved Merafong and Matatele. So a decision was made, for example, to exclusively demarcate Matatele into Eastern Cape, which used to be a municipality that straddles the boundaries of Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal. And residents of Matatele protested the decision of the government to transfer their municipality to Eastern Cape. They felt that they would receive better services in KwaZulu-Natal rather than Eastern Cape. The same in Merafong. So what we see here that identity-related concerns did not dominate the demarcation of local boundaries in South Africa. The demarcation body justified its decision based on functional criteria, and the communities that are affected by the proposed changes expressed their protests based on service delivery related concerns. But things have changed slightly with the event that unfolded in Limpopo around 2016. And that has to do with the demand of the residents of Malamulele, which is a community in the province of Limpopo, and the decision of the demarcation board, and the reaction that decision generated. Now, let me say a few things about that. So, the Thulamela municipality is located in the province of Limpopo. This is a municipality that inhabits largely two ethnic communities, the Vendas and the Tsonga. Now, the members of the Malamulele community who belong to the Tsonga ethnic group felt that the municipality benefits the Vendas speaking parts of the municipality, and it has neglected or disadvantaged the Tsonga speaking Malamulele community. So they requested for separate municipality. So in effect, they demanded to have their own ethnic municipality. Now, that request was initially rejected by the Municipal Demarcation Board. The Municipal Demarcation Board was wary of, or was concerned of that ethnic fragmentation that the creation of a separate municipality that would be dominated by the Tsonga speaking people would signify. So if I can quote, it says that the board says that the proposed boundary redetermination will perpetuate spatial fragmentation will separate communities along ethnic, tribal, and reintroduces apartheid boundaries. With the high concentration of the Tsonga community in the Malamulele area and the Venda community in the remainder of the Tulamela local municipality, this will result in the separation of the two communities along tribal lines, reminiscent of the apartheid past. So clearly, the board didn't want to create an ethnic municipality. The board felt that this would be reintroducing the era of Bantustanization. Now, that refusal by the board sparked violent protests and a 2 months long shutdown of all services in Malamulele. And so that continued for 2 months. And at some point, national official politicians started to intervene. And the National Minister for Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs visited the area, consulted the communities, and promised that their issue will be addressed. Now, at some point later on, the Minister for Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs requested the board to investigate the redemarcation of a number of boundaries, a number of municipal boundaries. And included in that request was the Tulamela municipality, which, as I said, is a municipality from which Malamulele is seeking to secede, is seeking to part with. Now, the Municipal Demarcation Board responded by establishing a new municipality, the Collins Chabane municipality. Now, that municipality comprised of Malamulele, which has been seeking, requesting its own to have its own municipality, but it also included Vuwani, which is a portion of the municipal area of Tulamela. Now, which means that now the new municipality comprised of Malamulele, which is dominated by the Tsonga people that belong to the Tsonga ethnic group, but also included Vuwani, which is dominated by a Venda-speaking community. Now, the demarcation board justified its decision to create a new municipality by making reference to the criteria of financial viability. So publicly and formally, so the board was not responding to the initial request posed by the members of the community of Malamulele, but justified its decision rather by making reference to the criteria of financial viability. But I think there are strong reasons to doubt if those were the real reasons behind the decision of the demarcation board to redetermine municipal boundaries in the way it did. Of course, it's formulated in the language of financial viability. But I think its decision to create a municipality that is numerically dominated by a community that has been demanding, that has been clamoring for its own municipality, for its own ethnic municipality, I think represents an ethnic solution to a problem that was articulated in ethnic terms. And I think that's also why the decision was well received by members of the community that belong to the Tsonga ethnic group, who have been demanding to secede from Tulamela, because it gives them a municipality in which they are an overwhelming majority. And I think the financial argument doesn't also hold water when one notes that the new municipality would be heavily dependent, like many other municipalities in the country, would be heavily dependent on financial transfers from the national government. In fact, there were some reports that suggested that the new municipality would have a grant dependency of more than 90%. So making it one of the most grant dependent municipalities in the province. So the financial argument doesn't seem to hold water, but also the reaction that the decision generated also betrays the ethnic element of the debate. Members of the vendor community, now that have now found themselves demarcated into this new municipality that is dominated by, numerically dominated by people that belong to the Tsonga ethnic group, objected to the decision of the demarcation board. So this fear of being an ethnic minority drove, I think, the fiercest resistance to local boundary changes that saw Vuwani engulfed by violence, as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. Now, so these members of the Vuwani community, so they objected to the incorporation of the areas to a municipality that is now dominated by the Tsonga people that belong to the Tsonga ethnic group, and they approached the court, and they were not successful. And then the Vuwani was engulfed by violence, as I said, where we saw a devastating destruction of public infrastructure, including more than 30 schools.
Jonathan, on that rather violent note, I need to remind
there was a task team in
you're running out of time, Jonathan.
Yes.
You need to wind up, please. Apologies.
Oh, okay. All right. So what we see here is that so ethnicity seems to have eventually managed to move into the debate about local boundaries. Now the question is, what explains? Let me to wrap up my presentation. What explains the injection of ethnicity into the boundary determination debate? Now, one explanation could be that the decision of the board to create this new municipality represents a departure from the South African approach of accommodating ethnicity, accommodating ethnic diversity without explicitly demarcating boundaries along ethnic lines. So in South Africa, the boundaries are not explicitly demarcated along ethnic lines. So if you look at for example, the provinces of South Africa, they are not defined in ethnic terms. But if you look at the demographic composition of each province, you'll see that the particular provinces are dominated by particular ethnic groups. So some of the provinces serve as a home of a particular ethnic groups. Let's say, for example, Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, Northwest, and others as well. That means that the same applies to the municipalities that make up the provinces. And that inadvertent match between ethnic boundaries and the political boundaries has allowed for accommodation of ethnicity, has ensured that ethnicity does not emerge as a major divide in the political space. That's because even if the provinces and the municipalities are not defined in ethnic terms, because they are dominated by particular ethnic groups, they allow for the representation of that ethnic group. They allow members of that community to dominate the political structure within those provinces and the municipalities, and they allow for the use of the language of those communities in the governance structures. So in that way, they accommodate diversity. But I think the decision of the board with respect to Malamule and the creation of this new municipality, I think represents a departure from that approach, from that implicit way of accommodating diversity. because as I said, an important element of the South African approach that is its implicit way of accommodating ethnic diversity. Accommodating ethnic diversity without making ethnicity the basis, the explicit basis for organizing a territory, whether it's a province or whether it's a municipality. But in this case, the decision of the demarcation board to accommodate the demands of the Malamulele community for an ethnic local government was anything but implicit. And it was
Jonathan.
seen, and unavoidably so, as the decision to create an ethnic-based local government. And hence, that's why I think we saw the ethnic-based backlash from Vuwani. So
Jonathan,
that, I think, explains to the reasons why
we need to round up now, please. Seriously.
Okay, so that explains. So that explains, in short, why ethnicity has emerged as a major, has injected itself into the debate about local boundary demarcations. Thank you. Let me stop that. Sorry about that.
Thank you very much, Professor Fessha. Very detailed and, yeah, somewhat sad account of how things have been dealt with in our country and the important role that ethnicity plays even in municipal demarcations. Thank you for that very good foundation for the rest of our talk this morning. I do not at this point see any questions in the Q&A for Professor Fessha. I will give a couple of seconds if anybody wants to post a question. Nothing at this point. In that case, thank you very much, Professor Fessha. I know that you have other engagements, so we will let you go and work. Thank you very much for your contribution this morning and for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, colleagues. That brings us then to the second presenters, which is a joint presentation. And may I please remind my presenters to please stick to your time allocations. So we have a joint presentation between Paula Knipe and Aisosa Omoruyi. Paula is with the Socioeconomic Rights Project at the Dula Omar Institute at the University of the Western Cape, affiliated to the law faculty. And she's been involved in various research and advocacy efforts over the last 5 years on women's rights and gender equality, access to justice, legal food environments, and non-communicable diseases. She's pursuing her LLB at this point, using a rights-based approach to investigate the double burden of malnutrition among women in South Africa. She's also involved in various research projects, currently focusing on diet-related NCDs and legal frameworks surrounding cancer. Very, very important research indeed. Paula, are you going to start off?
Thanks so much, Prof. Yes, I am. I wondered if you could please share the presentation on your side.
Melody,
or whoever's responsible.
Melody, would that be possible from your side?
I'm sorry, Prof. We have not received the presentation. If Paula opens it up on a screen, I can guide her.
Okay, I'll actually just go ahead. Maybe my colleague can bring it up at the second because my laptop's a bit, so when I know we're already pressed for time, so it's fine. I'll just talk through it and then maybe we can pick it up during the presentation. Thank you so much.
Can you kindly switch the camera on, please, Prof?
Oh, sorry, just give me a second.
If it's fine, I could share for you if that's fine.
Thanks
yes,
so
please.
much, Jennifer. The background is a bit blurred. Let me just.
You may remove the background, Prof. It's fine.
Yeah, I think, Paula, if you can remove the artificial background, because otherwise
you can't see me.
Yeah.
So you just give me 1 second. Is that better? Can you see me now?
That is much better. Thank you very much, Paula. You can proceed.
Thank you so much. So hello again, everyone. Thank you for having us. It's really an honor to be part of this discussion today, especially among so many colleagues who were my lecturers at that point. So let me dive straight in. We'll be looking at legal and policy frameworks to addressing diet-related non-communicable diseases, a pathway to realizing SDG 3. I'll be covering part A of the presentation, contextualizing the legal framework around diet-related NCDs and the active role of the state. And then I'll hand over to my colleague, who will be looking at a policy analysis on diet-related NCD prevention in South Africa, a pathway to realizing SDG 3. So my presentation outline will be as follows. I'll briefly, I think we don't have time to delve into everything, but hopefully sufficiently cover some of our ongoing research. So I'll just dive right in. So what and why the relationship between diet and disease? Looking at assessing state obligations, the role of the law, and what this looks like, and then I'll move to looking at some relevant actors who continue to shape our food environment, the food we eat, and then just delve into an overview of the way forward, what we intend to look at next. So we launched this project last year under Prof Durojaye, who will speak later on, and it's an ongoing project with the Global Center for Legal Innovation on Food Environments at the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law at Georgetown University in Washington, DC. So what and why NCDs? NCDs are in general known as chronic diseases and generally refer to conditions that are not infectious. They're often of long duration and progress slowly. The four main types of NCDs which contribute to 80% of NCDs include cardiovascular diseases, cancer, chronic lung disease, and diabetes. As we know, ensuring equitable access to healthy and nutritious food for all has continued to be one of the greatest challenges of the 21st century. And at present, there are roughly 795 million people who are undernourished, 2 billion people with micronutrient deficiencies, and roughly also 2.1 billion people who are overweight or obese. As we know, this has been amplified by the nutrition transition, and this is where we're now eating less traditional foods and more ultra-processed foods high in sugar, salt, and fat. And so what does the extent of this burden look like? Globally, NCDs are responsible for 74% of deaths, premature deaths. In South Africa, that number is currently at 57%, meaning that it's overtaken communicable diseases and is now the main cause of premature death, which is defined as deaths occurring before the age of 70. And alarmingly, this is rapidly continuing to rise. NCDs are usually the result of genetic, physiological, environmental, and behavioral factors. And the four that account for the largest number of NCDs is tobacco use, physical inactivity, the harmful use of alcohol, and unhealthy diets, which is the focus here today. These are commonly misunderstood as bad lifestyle choices, and while to a certain extent it is a choice, we know there are a number of systemic and social factors which continue to influence the decisions people make. And so these are known as the social and commercial determinants of health. And the idea here is to shift the blame, the individual blame that society has, as well as the perception that is so evident in a lot of our legal and policy framework, towards addressing the underlying determinants and drivers of NCDs. And the social determinants include the broad factors that continue to shape our daily life, looking at the economy, social norms and policies, poverty, healthcare, education, and how these inequalities intersect. And commercially, this includes the conditions, activities, and omissions by corporate actors, which continue to impact public health and the larger environment. And this is through the general expansion of trade, capital, and economic growth, and is channeled through marketing, advertising, supply chain management, and just the sheer influence and power that the commercial sector has to influence our frameworks. So we take a rights approach with this work because our work is centered on realizing the right to food and health. And maybe I won't delve into all of those, but the right to health is found in a number of international, regional, and domestic sources. Similarly, the right to food has been established and entrenched in relation to the right to health, as well as a standard alone right of utmost importance. And so our research is trying to build on this framework, which is also entrenched in the South African Constitution and has been on numerous accounts reaffirmed by our courts. So we've tried to delve into what the right does, what it could and should look like in the South African context. So therefore, it's not just I think what people perceive it as a moral duty. You know, it's in fact a legally binding state obligation to address diet-related NCDs and realize the right to food and health. And regulation is also important here because, as highlighted earlier, some of these commercial and corporate activities which impact the modifiable risk factors can be regulated to greatly reduce the burden of NCDs, some of which my colleague will delve into later on. What does this actually look like? What approaches have government taken in terms of preventing diet-related NCDs? So looking at assessing state obligations, looking at competing food and health in priorities, and the complexity of South Africa's food environment. As we know, the socioeconomic situation is bleak, has remained bleak, and the inequality gap continues to widen, which impacts poverty, unemployment, and access to healthy food, and a number of intersecting issues. And while South Africa has taken several legislative, regulatory, and policy steps to prevent diet-related NCDs, the food issues remain. And it's compounded by a number of challenges. As we know, it's in South Africa, we, like many other low and middle income countries, are experiencing the double burden of malnutrition. And this is where various forms of malnutrition, so undernutrition, overweight, obesity, and diet-related NCDs intersect and coexist at the same time among individuals, within households, communities, and society at large across the life course. And while we know South Africa is still facing a number of food insecurity challenges and hunger is still very much persistent, we cannot ignore the rate of obesity and diet-related NCDs, which continues to increase. And this is where the World Health Organization has put forward these best buys, which are intended to be applicable in low and middle income countries where they can address different forms of malnutrition, especially where the underlying factors or drivers are the same. And another reason it's important is, as we know, the state has an obligation to further protect vulnerable and marginalized populations, and specifically for the right to health and food without discrimination. This leads us to think about the role of law. So then how can these legal frameworks around undernutrition be adapted or applied to address overweight, obesity, and diet-related NCDs? As we know, the law can create a robust legal framework, which can be a useful instrument if used correctly. And we are still without an overarching national legal framework, which would guide national departments, institutions, and oversight bodies on this matter. The law also has the ability to mitigate these negative impacts of activities, as we mentioned earlier, to regulate and prevent certain activities that negatively impact public health. The law can also be used to enforce oversight and accountability mechanisms, to develop and set standard-setting bodies in this regard. And this takes us to our next point, looking at state and non-state actors. So how can the law be used to mitigate the effects of certain activities and actors that impact public health? Who is influencing food and nutrition policy spaces, and how does this impact the food that we eat? So in terms of government actors, institutions, and bodies, how can the state actively create a healthy food environment? Looking across, excuse me, spheres and levels, who is responsible? How is this food, the right to food, or the obligation to enforce the right to food and health perceived? Looking at these oversight and standard setting bodies, the Right to Health Committee that is nowhere to be found, that exists but has done very little to address any of these issues that I've mentioned. The courts, we now have some precedent on the right to food and how it's linked to a number of other rights, and this is something we will leverage going forward. I think looking more importantly, or another consideration that people don't take into mind, all these non-state actors and the sheer influence they have on the legal and food, the legal and policy frameworks on diet-related NCDs. So looking at the food and beverage industry, who is sponsoring government events or challenging regulations, or who is even on the board of these standard setting bodies. Looking at political parties, how is the right to food or health, and where is it on the political agenda? Looking at civil society organizations, how are we challenging this and taking it forward? And the media, again, looking at advertising and marketing and who regulates this. And so some final considerations on the way forward. These are issues we intend to delve into further as we continue this research and actively look at these perceptions and how the right to food and health is conceptualized within the government across spheres. Who's responsible for different priorities, different issues within the complex food environment. I think just to save us some time, I'll end there, and I'll now hand over to my colleague who will delve a little bit further into some of our findings and the policy analysis. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Paula. That was indeed very relevant. Can we just quickly introduce Aisosa before she starts? Aisosa Omoruyi is also linked to the Socioeconomic Rights Project at the La Umar Institute. Her research interests include socioeconomic rights, particularly also the right to health and sexual and reproductive health and the rights of women and intersectional discrimination. She's currently involved in research on the prevention of diet-related NCDs, as well as cancer prevention and control frameworks in South Africa. And she will now continue with this presentation.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you, Paula, for such a very well thought out background to what I'm going to be saying here today. I'm having a bit of challenges with my Wi-Fi. I think the bandwidth is low. And so just to ensure that there will be no interruptions along, can I just turn off my video if that's fine?
Yes, you may go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So flowing from Paula's discussion, I'm just going to be giving some results of our findings. As part of the project, we looked at several policy and legal frameworks in South Africa that are useful to preventing diet-related NCDs. And something we really focused on was assessing levels of policy coherence within South Africa, particularly relating to food and nutrition security, nutrition policies from the Department of Health, as well as trade policies and how they all work together towards preventing diet-related NCDs. And like Paula has mentioned, food systems are influenced and governed by various sectors of government, and this provides opportunity for multi-sectoral action towards promoting healthier diets and addressing influences that control what people eat, particularly making unhealthy food available and accessible. Achieving this requires that policies of various departments or sectors effectively complement each other. However, what is common is conflict between the objectives of various sectors, and in the context of diet-related NCDs prevention, we are concerned with tensions between food security policies, nutrition policies, as well as trade policies of government. In terms of food security policies, we question how do they respond to the double burden of malnutrition, essentially concerned with the conceptualization of malnutrition and what policy objectives and priorities aim at addressing food and nutrition insecurity, and what do these mean for diet-related NCDs prevention. Nutrition policies target the food industry to control nutrients of concern in processed food, essentially aimed at controlling what kinds of food are available out there to people to eat. And how well are these, how strong are these policies in actually regulating the food industry? What sort of influences of the industry is hampering the success of these policies? And definitely with trade policies, that back the economic growth priorities of government. How do they impact on diet-related NCDs prevention, particularly fueling the activities of the food industry? So, I'm sorry, I did not, I'll just share my slide now, my presentation. That was just a background. If you can see.
Yes, we can.
Okay, yeah. So, okay. So the first set of policies we looked at are the food and nutrition security policies in South Africa. And the aim was to find out what policy priorities guide food and nutrition security and how well they advance diet-related NCDs prevention. So we looked at the National Policy on Food and Nutrition Security, the National Food and Nutrition Security Plan, the National Food and Nutrition Security Communication Strategy, and an overarching policy framework, which is the National Development Plan. In terms of how food insecurity is conceptualized, the policies generally draw on the right to food in the Constitution and define food security as access to and control over the physical, social, and economic means to ensure sufficient, safe, and nutritious food at all times for all South Africans in order to meet the dietary requirements for a healthy life. This definition essentially connects the right to food and the right to health, emphasizing the importance of not just access to food, but to healthy nutrition, which is required for a healthy life. Essentially, it speaks to the double burden of malnutrition, particularly undernutrition and overnutrition, which access and nutritional quality are essential to addressing both problems. In the food security policies that we looked at, they essentially conceptualize the food insecurity problem as mostly undernutrition or hunger, while they definitely acknowledge that the link between NCDs and unhealthy diet and the role of the food industry. But they essentially see food insecurity as a result of food production challenges such as rising input costs, climate change, and limited platforms and opportunities for smallholder farmers, and also inadequate knowledge and information and financial means for citizens to make optimal food choices. And this is not just in the specific policies alone, but it also flows from the National Development Plan, which conceptualizes food insecurity as undernutrition as a more serious problem in South Africa, and inadequate nutrition is seen as less nutritious crops being produced. And the challenge with this is that they focus on seeing the food production problem and issues with nutrition education, essentially blaming the individual to say, oh, you should know better what to eat and you should make adequate choices, but essentially ignoring the influences that determine or shape the kinds of food that people eat, and particularly the food industry. So the objectives to address food insecurity across the policies relate mostly to strengthening food production, strengthening rural agriculture and emerging farmers, nutrition safety net, as well as nutrition education. So the problem with these policies is that they focus on the access component and less on nutrition, and this falls short in realizing the right to food. We have a problem with this because it ignores the influence of the food industry that majorly shapes access to unhealthy food through the increasing supply of ultra-processed products and all the strategies and marketing and influences through which they ensure that it gets to the tables of most households. And the right to food in itself focuses on meeting dietary needs, and it must be balanced from a nutrition standpoint. But unfortunately, the policies are focused on access alone. And there is this emphasis on nutrition education, which studies have shown that has very little impact in changing dietary behavior, particularly because nutrition, it's easier to create healthy defaults a food environment that supports healthy nutrition rather than educating people to eat healthy food, which is important but should not be relied on strongly. The nutrition health policies in South Africa, they see the unhealthy diet as a strong industry influence. So they try to control the activities of the food industry. And we have the regulations relating to labeling and advertising of foodstuff, the trans fat regulation, the salt reduction regulation, as well as the health promotion levy that taxes sugar sweetened beverages. While they are good steps in the right direction, they are still weak for several reasons. And like Paula said, some of their weaknesses relate to pushbacks from the food industry. For instance, labeling and advertising in South Africa is still at its weakest point because the labeling requirements are not good enough for consumer education. And the advertising, for instance, targeting children remains largely unregulated. The salt reduction regulations could be strengthened by limiting the use of salt by fast foods. And the sugar tax is currently standing at 11% compared to the 20% earlier recommended. As such, there's ongoing advocacy by several groups to strengthen our labeling and advertising requirements, as well as increasing the sugar tax. And then there's also the strategic plan for the prevention of non-communicable diseases, which speaks to improving healthy nutrition, although it's challenging because it focuses on it places more attention on clinical prevention rather than addressing diet-related NCDs, because the priorities in this regard in the plan are not so clear, they are not measurable, and do not really build on the success of the previous plan. I won't go into details with that, but the emphasis here is that while it's important to address, to take on clinical preventive measures like measures to control hypertension and other NCDs, we should understand that that is also capital intensive. And for countries where we are still struggling, it's important to focus on the measures of preventing NCDs that are most cost effective. And then with trade policies, because the economic growth priorities of government give the food industry reasonable, strong backing, and the influx of processed food and drinks becomes a very hard thing for government to regulate efficiently. And like Paula mentioned, the influence of the industry is really, really strong. And we see this playing out in how policies are being fought back and what really comes out at the end of the day. And the National Development Plan is definitely focused on food as an economic good that creates job and strengthening agricultural production and placing less attention on nutritional quality of food is the norm these days. But we are beginning to see some positive developments, like the termination of some investment agreements that have no objectives towards promoting public health. And the Protection of Investment Act seems to maintain a level of investor and investment protection, but tries to ensure that priorities in the Constitution, including relating to food and the right to health, are put forward and advanced while strengthening economic liberalization and that. So as a way forward, we think it is important that food and nutrition security interventions be guided by the right to food, emphasizing both the access component and the nutritional quality of the food supply. We can definitely strengthen the regulation on advertising, labeling, and salt regulation, as well as the sugar sweetened beverage tax. Prioritize cost-effective measures for addressing NCDs. And very importantly, the policy should be speaking to one another. Like they should complement each other towards preventing diet-related NCDs. I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My mute button went on a vacation for a moment there. Thank you very much, Aisosa and Paula, for a very interesting overview. And I was quite happily surprised to find the Investment Act there at the end. I haven't actually thought about it from that perspective. Obviously, food security, a very important issue in our country, and everything being aggravated at the moment with petrol price increases, the food insecurities created by the Ukraine war, etc. Colleagues, if you have any questions for Paula and Aisosa, please remember to post those questions in the Q&A box, and those questions that will then be dealt with at the end of the session. Thank you very much. That allows us then to move on to the next set of speakers, which is Fairuz Mullagee and Candice James from our social law project. So Fairuz particularly has been our coordinator at the social law project, which is part of the Center for Transformative Regulation of Work for quite a long time. She has a lot of experience in a number of different areas, but her current focus is on the establishment of a cooperative platform for domestic and care workers in South Africa, intended to serve as a model vehicle for worker empowerment and democratic ownership. Fairuz, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Professor Wandrag. I will share my screen. Is that visible to everyone?
Thank
you. Yes, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. I will be sharing this presentation with my colleague, Candice James, who has also been on the project since the start, I suppose. Yeah, so the Digital Platform Cooperative Project is something which grew out of research we had been doing on the domestic sector. Having spent quite a bit of time and effort looking at the impact of legislation on the lives and livelihoods of domestic workers, one of the key findings that came out of the original research was, just in terms of the atomized nature of work, the difficulty organizing domestic workers, and just finding and the sector remaining underdeveloped and poorly organized. That was one of the key findings from our research, which started way back in 2010. And so, having sort of gone through all the kind of processes in terms of developing policy, all the way to the ILO with Convention 189 in 2011, as far back as 2011, and our own laws, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, the Sectoral Determination 7, specifically for domestic workers in 2002. All of, we found that the sector is very well covered in terms of legislation, policy, but in terms of the impact on the lives of domestic workers, it falls seriously short. And so in 2018, around 2018, we were introduced to a whole new concept of work, I suppose, and by which time, the whole notion of non-standard work had become quite a serious focal area, especially in the labor law arena. And so, grappling with issues of deficits in the law in terms of the kind of rights afforded to workers became an increasing focus area. So, the whole notion of digitization, 4IR had become the buzzword. And by about 2018, I think, you know, there was great excitement around the Uber model, you know, the kind of gig economy. And by 2018, we were approached by a group of Uber drivers. This is the Social Law Project, had been approached by what came to be known as the Uber 7. And these were 7 Uber drivers who chose to challenge the Uber model and challenge the company in terms of what came to be known as a kind of misclassification of workers as independent contractors. Anyway, the 7 workers decided to challenge Uber, you know, and the CCMA kind of upheld the claim that, you know, Uber is effectively an employer, you know, and workers should be afforded, you know, drivers should be afforded the same rights. So as we were, you know, engaged with this struggle and, you know, the kind of challenges of gig workers started becoming a reality. First, there was great excitement, you know, workers could work when they choose to, the flexibility of work and so forth. But when the reality hit home, you know, the glaring gaps in terms of the protections of workers soon became evident. So at that time, as we were dealing with this matter, you know, the realization dawned that domestic workers had been gig workers for as long as we'd been engaged, well, longer, but, you know, it kind of, that reality hit home to us. And so we developed this idea for exploring and examining the possibility of looking at alternative ways of organizing and enabling domestic workers. And so that's how this project came about. So WeCare, well, the digital platform cooperative project is really, you know, the project that kind of grew out of the whole idea of gig work and the Uber model. But you know, the idea to, you know, to mitigate the kind of challenges presented by the Uber model, the exploitative, the exploitative character that we had experienced or observed with the Uber model. And so the idea of a worker-owned model, you know, started sort of forming, and we consulted with the trade unions for domestic workers who had been struggling to organize, who themselves had been struggling to organize and continue to have difficulty organizing and sustaining themselves as a trade union. Consulted with them and many others on the idea, and yeah, I think it was, you know, developed a proposal. There was great excitement among workers also, you know, also just the idea of being able to have this flexibility. You could be a driver in the morning, you could be a domestic worker in the afternoon and so forth. So the idea was to use the technology in a different way, and rather than using it as a tool for super exploitation, the idea was to use it as a tool for transformation. So the developmental objective of the digital platform cooperative project is that work performed by domestic and other targeted workers is valued and conditions are decent. Workers have the financial security and knowledge and are able to enjoy human dignity and overcome social marginalization. So that's essentially the developmental objective. So in 2019, we managed to, it was very hard to secure funding for the project. And in 2019, we managed to find a partner, and thus we started phase 1 of the DPCP, which was the research and development for a worker-owned model. And you can see, we've registered this as a company to secure the name. And this is a name that the workers themselves had decided upon. So phase 1 was from 2020 and it ends now in 2022. Now, for the purpose of this presentation, we kind of also looked at how it fits into the SDGs, and the primary objective of the project aligns to Goal 8, which is to promote sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment and decent work for all. So that is the overarching goal to which this project is aligned. And the work of the Social Law Project and Centro, while kind of focused on SDG 8 and also interacts with a number of other SDGs. Goal 1, ending poverty in all its forms. Goal 5, achieving gender equality. And Goal 10, reducing inequalities within and among countries. So I think it's important just to mention that, because the work of the project, while it is focused on establishing an alternative model in 2 cities in South Africa, being Cape Town and Johannesburg being the economic hubs, we've also started building networks with similar initiatives elsewhere, and also with the ILO and associated institutions. So just to talk a little bit about the research methodology, it is very much located in the realm of empowerment and co-creation, capacity building and action research. And I think importantly here also is connecting theory with practice. And I think, when my colleague, when Candice talks, she will also illustrate further. And I think, for researchers, young emerging researchers, I think it's an interesting project for people like that coming through, because I do believe that the community engagement aspect and focus of scholarly research, it's important that we begin to just sort of emphasize that in the work that we do, testing our theories in practice. It's one thing to locate our work, and it's not one being better than the other. I just do believe that we're living through very critical times, and it is important that we do begin to test our knowledge and theory. So yes, very much located in the realm of empowerment, research, building capacity. So the way we've gone about it through quite a detailed and intense process. We targeted at the start of the project, which was in 2020, we targeted 60 people, 60 domestic workers. The idea was 30 in Cape Town, 30 in Johannesburg, and took them through a process. In fact, the first 47 will be graduating next month. So the process of selection was, through interacting with our trade union partners, the Migrant Workers Union of South Africa, and also the Social Law Project database of domestic workers that we've been working with over the years. So we identified a group of 60 for the initial development phase. And so that group of workers, it's quite erratic because the process is quite intense. You have people who work full days and have to give up their time to engage with the project, because at the end of the day, this project is an intervention. It is an intervention based on research conducted previously and work with the target group. An intervention was proposed, and so we established this core group of domestic workers in the 2 sites. And all of that also had to be quickly transformed to an online process when COVID hit in 2020. So, all of these ideas in terms of organizing, in terms of developing, in terms of feeding back, in terms of learning, all of this had to transform itself from a face-to-face kind of program, because that is how this program was envisaged originally. So on the one hand, yes, it was intended to be a digital and still is the idea for a digital platform project, but it was never intended to be a fully online development process. So, the impact of COVID on this development program has also had its positive spin-offs, because the digitization process was literally fast-tracked, through as a result of the restrictions placed on workers. So yes, the empowerment model, building capacity, action research, so all of these, the approach enables us to use different strategies for collecting data and making this very, very clear to the target group their own role in the process of knowledge production. So based on our research into an appropriate model, we started out, and it was a kind of response to the exploitative nature of the tech companies that we had been exposed to, particularly Uber, which is very, very popular. And so the response, to that was to find a model which kind of counteracts the exploitative nature of the enterprise. And so that it's that on the one hand, and also the challenges that we saw, that we observed with the organizing model, which was very much located in and based on the industrial model. The trade union model, we thought, has its place, of course, but we've also observed the difficulties and so the impact of that in terms of the rights protection for domestic workers. And so we explored the idea of co-creating an enterprise underpinned by the 7 cooperative principles. And by this time, we'd also kind of connected with, we were not alone, the New School University in New York had also been doing quite a bit of work around the cooperative platform model as an alternative. So this has kind of been quite a strong influence in the project. So yes, co-creation based on the 7 cooperative principles. So we had taken the first cohort of 60
Fairuz,
domestic workers. Sorry.
you have basically used all 20 minutes. Candice still have to speak.
Okay, I'll stop there. And my word, does 20 minutes go up that quickly? Sorry, yes, Candice.
It does.
I think Candice can quickly talk to the meat of the program beyond the, yeah.
Thank you
Sorry,
very
I
much.
just
Fairuz. Very
did
sorry
this.
to cut you short. This is a very important project, also from the side of the department and Central, of course. Candice, if you are ready to take over. Candice James is
thank
also
you.
a researcher on the
Apologies,
Digital
Candice.
Cooperative Project at SLP, the same project that Fairuz has been talking about. Candice, without wasting more time, over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof and Fairuz. If you can see my screen. Yeah, so Fairuz has covered quite a number of the project process that we've been through this year. This diagram in front is just a sort of ecosystem of our key role players that we've engaged with over the last 2 years. We have our domestic workers, employers of domestic work services, organized labor, government, businesses, tech startups, and other institutions. But as mentioned, our engagement with our beneficiaries over the last 2 years will sort of set the slide and tone for the next few slides. And it touches on WeCare's contribution to SDG 5 specifically, which is aimed at promoting gender and women empowerment, specifically identifying or aligning to target B, which is the promotion of women empowerment through technology. As Fairuz mentioned, we've engaged quite extensively with our domestic workers, which we also refer to as our beneficiaries. On screen, you'll see the themes, the major themes that we've covered from 2020, which included the introduction to digital literacy, the 7 cooperative principles, and an introduction to the digital platform economy and what that is. 2020 was specifically geared towards enabling domestic workers to understand their mobile devices and using their mobile devices for the better and as a tool to help communicate and to help organize as well as to learn. In 2021, we continued going through the digital platform economy and also looked at leadership and the group dynamic themes, which came quite strongly through for our beneficiary cohort. And going into the business models, given that we are building an enterprise, domestic worker owned or run enterprise. So these were important themes that needed to be covered, and we've engaged extensively with our domestic workers in these themes. We've also been quite mindful of the language barriers and the lack of digital fluency that our domestic workers had, hence 2020 focusing solely on the digital capacity building and digital literacy, moving into 22 where we continued that learning and skill. And because of the need for the capacity building, which was aimed at helping the domestic workers to be ready and capable of running their own enterprise, we focused quite a lot on empowering our beneficiaries in these spaces. We've also shifted 2022 so that it aligns more to the project deliverables at the end of the research and development phase, which is the development of a tech platform, including a website, a web application, and a mobile application, which WeCare will be able to be accessed to and from. And we've done covered governance through the constitution making process for the WeCare enterprise, as well as bringing something new in, which was wellness, looking at wellness on both an individual level and on the organizational level for our domestic workers. And it included financial wellness, organizational wellness that we've covered quite extensively in 2022. In terms of participation, when we started in 2020, we had an average of 41 domestic workers on our project. And that sort of fluctuated over the last 2 years with an average of 25 workers showing up to our sessions that we have every second Saturday in 2021 and in 2022. But with 2022, it was quite encouraging seeing a committed cohort of 45 domestic workers who have invested in themselves and invested their time to be part of the project and involved in structures where we've seen democratic processes for class representatives being nominated and selected, assistant class representatives coming through, as well as members being co-opted to leadership in 2022. And it also put into operation structures which we've developed in 2021 with our domestic worker cohorts. So at the moment, we have a committed cohort of 45 domestic workers who join on our Saturday sessions and have small weekly group meetings on Wednesdays mostly, to discuss the project, to get to know each other and engage and be part of the participatory and action-based research that Fairuz alluded to earlier. As mentioned, we are using or trying to use digital technologies as a tool for transformation that has also helped us in the method of empowerment through technology, with the shift from doing physical workshops in 2020 to 2021 and 2022 being completely online because of the impact of COVID and also the domestic workers' familiarity and comfortability working with technology. And the key or the main forms of mobile apps that we've used is WhatsApp, which continues to be our key point for communication of both formal and informal communications with our participants, as a large majority of our participants are quite familiar with it and have access to it. Data to use WhatsApp is much readily available than to use data for platforms such as our Google Classroom. Although we do provide data where we share information through our Google Classroom that we developed in or that we started using in 2021 to facilitate our online engaging and learning with our domestic workers, but with the hope that the technology that we're building, including the WeCare website, would be the main port for domestic workers to access opportunities to work, opportunities to organizing and learning. So the website itself is still being developed, and we're hoping to develop our mobile application, and these would be tested in our next phase from 2023 to 2025. As well as using our website as a port where there is resources available to domestic workers, and issues that we've noticed through our research are very prevalent in the sector, sexual and gender-based violence, and resources and outlines that would be easily accessible for our domestic workers using the mobile app or the web application, information and awareness raising to rights and inclusions in COIDA, UIF, and other relevant informations that we are still in the process of identifying that would help and empower domestic workers in both their awareness and knowledge, as well as their skill in using it. My last slide is a video, if I'm allowed for time, that speaks to how our domestic workers see WeCare and what WeCare means to them. So it has a narration of two of our domestic workers in our video. Prof Ricky, if you can let me know if the sound of the video is working.
Noted.
The first thing that is
Candice, I don't think the video is playing. We may have to, well, the video is playing, but I'm not hearing the sound, so we may have to skip on that. Sound is very, very soft.
So that's the main thing that's different that we are doing.
Are you able to hear the sound better now?
Organization, I would like to see it spelled out.
Not really, Candice. In the interest of time, I think
Okay.
we may have to skip the video. Sorry about that.
Okay, no, that's completely okay. Okay, so the next section just speaks about moving into phase 2, as I mentioned, where we'll be testing the WeCare model that we have developed with a vision for the WeCare enterprise being a world of dignified work in the domestic sector, and our mission to enable communities of practice in the domestic sector through organizing, supporting decent work, learning, and advocacy. That is, the end of our presentation. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Candice, and thank you very much for the important work you're doing. And thank you also to you and Fairuz for, in your presentation, answering the question that Dr. Mpangavanu has posted. In other words, what the link is to the specific SDGs. I believe that you have clearly indicated that in both parts of your presentation. So thank you very much for that. That then brings us reminder to everybody to put your questions in the Q&A. Presenters, if you would please be willing to share your presentations in the chat box for everybody, that would be great. So our next speaker is Professor Kitty Malherbe, who put up a very modest bio, but she is a colleague of mine in the Department of Mercantile Law at the University of the Western Cape. She is one of the eminent scholars in the country on social security law and also in labor law. Her focus is on social security rights of vulnerable people, specifically older persons, but also persons with disabilities, domestic workers, and caregivers. So I'm going to promptly hand over to my colleague. Kitty, are you ready?
I am. Thank you very much, Ricky, and good morning to everyone. I am going to share my screen, and just so that I'll be able to see what's happening on the screen, I will unfortunately have to switch my camera off so that I can sit right on the screen. There we go. My topic is addressing poverty and inequality by means of national social protection floors. And yes, the socioeconomic devastation that was caused by the restrictions that were imposed to combat COVID-19 infections and the persistently high unemployment rates have, of course, highlighted the deficits in the current social security framework. The estimated 10 million plus recipients of the Social Relief of Distress Grant, which was created as an extraordinary measure in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, supports that there are significant gaps in the realization of social security rights in South Africa. Of course, the Social Relief of Distress Grant was an incredibly necessary temporary measure, but it needs to be replaced by a statutorily guaranteed measure. The situation where millions of indigent people are at the mercy of ad hoc arrangements simply has to end. But what do we replace the Social Relief of Distress Grant with? measures that form part of the proposed National Social Security Fund, a basic income grant, or yet another type of targeted grant, or a combination of these. Now, this presentation locates this discussion of Social Security reforms in Section 27 of the Constitution at domestic level and international cooperation in achieving SDGs 1 and 8, and to some extent, of course, 3, with a particular focus on the creation of national social protection floors to address poverty. It builds on my previous research on realizing the social security rights of members of vulnerable groups, and specifically older persons, in order to address poverty. Section 27 of the Constitution guarantees everyone the right to have access to Social Security, including, if they're unable to support themselves and their dependents, appropriate social assistance. Now, for many activists and organizations, the absence of a definition of Social Security is problematic. They are not alone. Even Constitutional Court judges have occasionally had difficulty in conceptualizing Social Security law. One thinks of the Maslangu versus Minister of Labour case of 2021. But for a Social Security law specialist, that difficulty does not exist. An astute bit of constitutional interpretation gets one to the two parts, the two branches of Social Security, which are social assistance and social insurance. But ultimately, it's not the lack of a definition that is a problem. It is the fragmented nature of the current system. It looks impressive because of its scope and the number of people who are included, but it's like Swiss cheese. It has holes in the inside. So there are serious social security deficits. Millions of people in South Africa qualify for neither social insurance because they don't have the type of employment that would provide them access to it, nor social assistance because they cannot meet the requirements for the current statutory grants. That is why extraordinary measures like the social relief of distress grant has to be taken. As a lawyer, I don't have the expertise to posit what the best alternative framework would be. All I can do is to test the current framework and proposed reforms against the Constitution. So the test would then, of course, be whether any proposed Social Security reforms would be reasonable measures to progressively realize the right to have access to Social Security given the available resources. Now, the current framework does not meet the test for reasonableness as set in the Grootboom case because it does not provide access to Social Security to vulnerable people. Specifically, those people who are aged 18 to 59 and who are not earning an income and not raising children. So, how has this been addressed internationally? In search for an answer for how to address this, let us start with the ILO Decent Work Agenda. Of course, the ILO's Decent Work Agenda corresponds, as Fairuz said, to SDG 8. To promote decent work for all, the main strategies in the Decent Work Agenda, and that's now apart from the overarching strategy of gender equality, is promoting rights at work, protecting rights at work, creating employment, strengthening social dialogue, and then for the purposes of this presentation, the most significance is extension, the strengthening of social protection. This is important for the ILO because the ILO recognizes that Social Security is an important tool to prevent and reduce poverty, inequality, social exclusion, and social insecurity. Also to promote equal opportunity and gender and racial inequality, equality and to support the transition from informal to formal employment. So, what is central to this presentation is the notion of national floors of social protection. And I'm going to argue that the national floors of social protection approach would constitute a reasonable measure and allow for progressive realization of social security rights. Now, for the die-hard definition enthusiasts, the ILO Social Protection Floors Recommendation 202 of 2012 provides a definition. This recommendation was adopted in terms of the ILO's Decent Work Agenda, and it defines social protection floors as nationally defined sets of basic social security guarantees which secure protection aimed at preventing or alleviating poverty, vulnerability, and social exclusion. To quote Gijsbert Vonk, Recommendation 202 reflects the human rights approach in ILO wrapping paper. And this is an important point because Recommendation 202 reflects an international consensus on national social protection floors as a measure to address poverty. Clause 3 of Recommendation 202 contains a long list of principles, they're not even all on screen, that member states should apply in giving effect to Recommendation 202. And it includes, and here it is very important to see that universality of protection is at the top of the list. Also important, entitlement to benefits. Equally important, adequacy and predictability of benefits, which currently is so sorely lacking with the social relief of distress grant. Then principles such as non-discrimination, social inclusion, respect for the rights and dignity of beneficiaries, solidarity, and also important for the rest of the discussion, the consideration of a variety of methods and approaches. The ILO doesn't intend to be prescriptive on what national floors of social protection should look like. And then, of course, in the context of SDGs, sustainability with due regard to social justice and equity. Now, many of these principles correspond with constitutional values and rights, but it also demonstrates how much work still needs to be done if South Africa is aiming to create social protection floors. In terms of Clause 5 of Recommendation 202, national social security floors should include, and this is very important, basic social security guarantees. These should, and I quote, ensure at a minimum that over the life cycle, all in need have access to essential health care and to basic income security, which together secure effective access to goods and services defined as necessary at the national level. So these basic social security guarantees include access to essential health care, which is where it corresponds to SDG 3, basic income security for children, basic income security for, and this is very important in the context of the many people who are currently excluded, persons in active age who are unable to earn sufficient income, and then also basic income security for older persons. So there you can see it's protection over the life cycle. But the protection for older persons is, of course, very important as it protects particularly vulnerable groups like older persons. So basic income security for all does not require sacrificing the special protection for older persons. Of course, basic social security guarantees should be established by national laws, and these laws should also include the procedures by which the national level of benefits can be reviewed. That, of course, would allow for progressive realization. So that brings us to the debate on which route Social Security reform should take. And I'm going to measure it against the social protection floor principles. Do we go for a comprehensive social security system, which would include a national social security fund that's open to most workers, a more comprehensive take on the traditional pillared approach? And as you can see from the image, most pillared approaches have multiple pillars that then keep the whole system aloft. This was the approach proposed by the Green Paper on Comprehensive Social Security Reform in 2021. It appeared and then very quickly disappeared. The Department of Social Development had to hastily withdraw it after the outcry after its publication. So the pillared approach is all well and good, but it takes time to develop, and it should not be an immediate priority. So targeted grants. So do we replace the social relief of distress grant with yet another targeted grant? It, of course, would not meet the principle of universality in recommendation 202. And we have to acknowledge that the whole point of means test and other targeting measures is to exclude people, to create a situation where people do not have coverage. And there's, of course, the danger of discrimination as well. Caregivers of children who applied for the social relief of distress grant from 1 month to the next has no idea whether they will be included or not, because the goalposts keep shifting. So there's a clear need for more reliable social assistance with clarity on whom to hold accountable if an application is not successful, where the application was successful and the grant is just not paid, and how to access remedies. Okay, and that brings us to the big topic of the day, and all eyes are on the medium-term budget statement tomorrow, and that is universal income in the form of a basic income grant. It, of course, hits all the right notes as far as providing a social protection floor is concerned, as there would be no gaps in coverage. Now, to the extent that the administrative capacity of the state allows, it also provides more permanent income security to everyone. But of course, that universality of it is the big problem. It's the main criticism against the basic income grant. Arguments that it's plainly not affordable have rendered it, dare I call it, South Africa's own notorious BIG. It has its fans and its detractors. Now, if we look at recommendation 202, we see that it allows for different approaches depending on the national context. So combinations of measures can be allowed, and therefore basic social guarantees include universal benefits. They don't consist only of them. But then, of course, when we look at affordability, it's also true that social protection floors are usually most needed in countries that may not have the fiscal space to create universal schemes. And then secondly, on the basis of case law, both the phrases within available resources and progressive realization can be interpreted as meaning that at the very least, a coherent and transparent strategy towards creating that fiscal space required for universal benefits is required. The ILO has made data available about successful universal income schemes and truly valuable South African research by organizations such as the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute and Black Sash, and leading academics, both at this university and other institutions, support the argument that the basic income grant has significant transformational impact. There's, of course, international support for national social security floors. Meeting the targets for SDGs 1, 3, and 8 is a global endeavor. The ILO's Decent Work Agenda and Recommendation 202 shows the international commitment to national social protection floors. I can mention the joint efforts of UN agencies working as one to create and extend national social protection floors. And the ILO has also worked in partnership with various stakeholders towards this approach. Now, of course, adequacy of benefits is key, and specifically in meeting the SDG 1 target of substantial coverage of the poor and the vulnerable by social protection floors. The ILO has, in most of its publications, declared that it believes that national social protection floors are affordable to most developing countries, but they need support in order to build and scale up the national systems, and therefore the ILO provides technical and administrative support. So, given the available international support and the human rights imperative to eliminate poverty, the creation of national social protection floor legislation should be prioritized. There should be increased cooperation, no more solo, or can we call them silo projects like the Green Paper. We have to move from overlaps and gaps in social security reforms to creating a solid floor of social protection. Further social security reforms to improve and extend existing social security measures can follow, but South Africa should prioritize the creation of basic social security guarantees in order to realize everyone's social security rights and to meet the targets set in terms of SDGs 1, 3, and 8. I provide a list of my publications that I have published on the topic of social security reforms, and all that remains is to say thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Malherbe, and well done on perfect timekeeping. Your chair is incredibly grateful.
Known for that.
Thank you very much. Please feel free to share your presentation in the chat if you want, especially so that people can actually see the additional publications that you have referred to at the end of your. Sorry, see, you've actually stopped before the beeper went off there. Thank you very much, Melody. We are ready for the next speaker. So the last speaker then at this point, colleagues, in the meantime, before Professor Durojaye starts speaking, I can highlight to you that there's been a question posed in the question and box, which has been actually answered in writing around the communicable, non-communicable diseases speakers. So please feel free to go and check the question and answer in the question and answer box. It's now my pleasure to welcome Professor Ebenezer Durojaye, also a colleague from the Dullah Omar Institute, where he heads the Socioeconomic Rights Project. And his interests include human rights, socioeconomic rights, the right to health, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and gender and constitutionalism, clearly also linked to the SDGs that we have been discussing this morning. Ibn Eser, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Wandrag. And it's always a difficult thing trying to be the last presenter, but I will do my best in this circumstance. I will try to share my presentation.
We're not seeing anything yet, Ibn Eser.
Okay. So in the meantime, let me just start speaking to my presentation. The presentation is looking at the relevance of a right-based approach to maternal health as a way of achieving SDG 3 specifically. So what I've done is to look at what maternal mortality, understanding maternal mortality, looking at the definition provided by WHO, which is to the effect that any death that occur during pregnancy or childbirth or 42 days after childbirth, will also be regarded as part of a maternal death, as case may be. And I also try to explain what is meant by maternal mortality ratio. Is a very important indicator to measure states' performance in terms of addressing maternal mortality. We often refer it as MMR, and it will come up more later on in the course of my presentation. So one of the questions I also posed in my presentation has to do with why women die during pregnancy and childbirth. Thank you very much. So that's why the reasons why women die during pregnancy and childbirth. And studies upon studies have shown us over the years reasons why women die during pregnancy. There are medical reasons. There are also social, cultural issues relating to maternal mortality. The WHO said that medical reasons account for 75% of all maternal deaths. This includes severe bleeding, mostly after birth, infections, usually after childbirth, high blood pressure during pregnancy, which is often referred to as pre-eclampsia or eclampsia, as the case may be, complications from delivery, and of course, unsafe abortion. These are the medical reasons why women die from pregnancy, and some of the social issues or factors that leads to death during pregnancy or childbirth. There's a popular term called the 3 delays. This has to do with delays in deciding to seek appropriate medical help for an obstetric emergency, delay in reaching an appropriate obstetric facility, and delay in receiving adequate care when a facility is reached. So these are very important reasons as we see we go on. I also need to emphasize that in terms of maternal deaths, we have seen over the years, a considerable reduction from the 1990s, where about 500,000 women used to die every year, to now it has come down to about 200, over 200 deaths per annum. But the problem still have to be that most of the deaths still occur in developing countries, particularly in Africa. So that has raised the issue of inequality among regions and even within states. We see that most of women that die, in a particular country, we have to be women either in the rural areas, women who are disadvantaged and don't have access to good medical care, women who, as a result of poverty, struggle to make a living. So all these factors also have implication for maternal death. So in addition to the 3 delays, I also identified gender inequality and low status of women. Very important. In this time and age, we have a situation where some women need to seek permission of their husband to seek medical treatment, including antenatal care. So this is very problematic in terms of how they can detect difficulties in pregnancy at the early stage. I said poverty is very important. Some studies also shown that people couldn't go for antenatal simply because they couldn't afford transportation fare, which is a big challenge for people, especially for women in rural areas. Some other social determinants of health also important. where you live, the surrounding, the sanitation, availability to water, sanitation, they're very crucial for women. And we know that when women are pregnant, they are very susceptible to any form of infections. And so when you don't live in a very hygienic environment, that could also predispose to, could cause, lead to maternal death, as the case may be. So meetings SDG3, so SDG3.1, what does this say? It practically requires states to reduce maternal death by 70 per 100,000 live births, by 2030. This is different from what we have in MDG5, which requires states to reduce maternal mortality by 75%. So there's been this debate about the question of using percentage and being specific with figure. So most scholars or civil society group believes that SDG3 is far more better in terms of giving concrete figures to address maternal mortality. So we were looking at 70 deaths per 100 live birth. And this is what you will recall that in my earlier study, I said that the maternal mortality ratio is very crucial in measuring the steps states have taken in order to address maternal mortality. So it's a very important factor to determine whether you are making progress. So the higher the maternal mortality ratio, it means that a state is not doing enough to address maternal death, in its country, as the case may be. Other important indicator has to do with the proportion of births attended by skilled healthcare provider, and so a very important also indicator. We're still seeing that in many parts of the world, especially in Africa, the number of skilled care providers attending to women during pregnancy, they're very low compared to other regions. We also know that up to now in some communities, births are still not attended by skilled healthcare provider, but rather traditional birth attendant. Since also when complications arise during birth in rural areas, it's very difficult for them to get someone who is very skilled that can attend to this situation. And time is very, very crucial in terms of women experiencing complications during childbirth. Contraceptive prevalence is very important. So the higher the contraceptive rates, the likelihood of the maternal mortality to be reduced, but the lower the contraceptive rate in a particular community, that means there's likelihood of higher maternal mortality in that community. So adolescent birth rate is also a very important indicator. So we know that teenage pregnancy has its own complications. If an adolescent gets pregnant at a very early stage, it could lead to it could be dangerous for the health and the well-being of that adolescent, and more importantly, it could lead to maternal death or even morbidity. We know that what is called fistula, which could also be a very dangerous thing for a young girl giving birth. It's also studies have shown us that it's communities or countries where we have high child marriages. That means that the maternal mortality is likely to be very high in those communities as well. That brings the correlation between adolescent birth rate and maternal mortality. And we've seen it in some countries like Niger, like Chad. If you look at the maternal mortality rate in those countries, are very, very high. And even in northern part of Nigeria, where child marriage is also very rampant. So we see that compared to certain part of Nigeria, the number of maternal mortality deaths is very high, in the northern part. Antenatal care coverage, very important indicator also that how many times a woman, a pregnant woman is able to attend antenatal, during pregnancy. Studies are also showing many parts of Africa, particularly in rural area, women don't often attend antenatal care simply because they don't want to, but because of the distance, because of finances, and because of other things. Which could also make it very difficult for them. The important thing about antenatal is that once a pregnant woman constantly attend antenatal, one could easily detect danger at the early stage, which and prevent maternal death. But where a woman has not had the opportunity to attend antenatal, then complication may arise at the very dying minutes or last minutes, and they may not be able to seek help as appropriate. And even when they want to seek, they may not have this key care provider that can provide that. Ensuring universal access to family planning services. This was originally missing MDG, but it's now here, in SDG as a very important component that universal access to sexual and reproductive care, including family planning services, is very, very important for addressing maternal mortality. So the question we want to ask ourselves is Africa moving towards realizing SDG 3. And we can only see that from the figures we have. The maternal mortality ratio in many African countries remain very high. I've said it. If you look at Nigeria, one of the economic powers in Africa, about 861 deaths per 100,000 live births. That is the MMR, which is very high. And SDG 3 is aiming for 70 by 2030. So it means Nigeria has a long way to go in terms of meeting the SDG 3, in terms of reducing its MMR to as high as much as possible to meet 70 deaths per 100 live births. The average number of delivery attended by healthcare provider in Africa is 47%, and that is lower than the average of 60% worldwide. And then if you look at some other parts of the world, like Southern and Eastern Asia, they've attained about 88%. And so that means we are still really, really back. We are really way back compared to other parts of the world. About 2/3 of all births are still to young women. This is also very risky. Like I have identified that, early pregnancy, early adolescent pregnancy, high pregnancy rate among adolescents is very dangerous for the health of the woman, and also can lead to maternal deaths, high maternal mortality rate. Contraceptive use is also very poor in many parts of Africa, especially in rural areas. Family planning services inaccessible to many people, and like I also mentioned, especially those in rural areas, still don't enjoy access to universal access to family planning care. So in a bid to address maternal mortality, sometimes in 2009, the African Union, in conjunction with the United Nations Population and Funds, established the campaign for the accelerated reduction of maternal mortality in Africa. We call it CAMA. And the whole essence of CAMA is that to mobilize effort, resources by African government to attempt to reduce maternal mortality, ensure universal access to healthcare services, including sexual and reproductive health services in many parts of Africa. And currently, we have about 46 members of the EU that have launched their own CAMA in their different countries. Unfortunately, despite CAMA, we're still seeing that it's still a long road for African countries to meet the SDG 3. And of course, many of African countries, including Nigeria and South Africa, the economic powers, did not meet MDG 5 in terms of reducing maternal mortality by 75%. So we asked ourselves, why do we need human rights to address maternal mortality? Why is it relevant? Why is it important to address maternal mortality? And one of the reasons is that human rights can help to apply to remedies disadvantages that predispose women to vulnerable conditions during pregnancy. It also needs to be said that maternal mortality must be viewed as a matter of social injustice. I've said it that most of the women that die, they are disadvantaged in one way or another, either because they are from rural area, either because they are poor, either because they don't have the means or resources to take good care of themselves. And that means state has a very important obligation in order to address some of these disadvantages women encounter that could predispose them to maternal death. Human rights remains important tools of holding government accountable for failure to prevent maternal death. Yes, and that's why we see maternal mortality as a matter of social injustice. Government has that obligation to preserve lives, particularly women's lives. We know that the technologies are there, the resources are there in some countries that they could use to prevent maternal mortality. But unfortunately, most African countries, governments are not doing enough in terms of channeling their resources to address maternal mortality. We recall that sometimes in 2001, the African government met in Abuja and they agreed to commit about 15% of the annual budgets to address health issues, including maternal mortality. Unfortunately, To date, very few African countries have lived up to this promise in terms of allocating 15% to maternal to healthcare, including maternal health. So resources are very important in terms of addressing. It's one good thing to start a campaign like KAMA, but where the resources are not there, when we don't have this key care provider, when government are not recruiting qualified healthcare provider, and when we are not properly remunerating our healthcare providers, and many of them are flying or leaving the continent for greener pastures, in the well-developed country, it becomes very problematic in terms of how to address maternal mortality. It's also, human rights, makes it obligatory for government to respect, to protect, and fulfill women's needs, health needs. And I will expatiate more about what this implies in terms of human rights, in terms of some rights that may be violated in relation to maternal mortality. Human rights makes it imperative for government to ensure that comprehensive access to maternal care services is a matter of rights and not a privilege. And unfortunately, in many African countries, we are still not doing enough to make it a right issue rather than a very a matter of still seen as a privilege that providing universal care services for women in terms of particularly in relation to maternal mortality. And that's why in most rural areas, we see that government's presence is not fair in terms of access to healthcare services for women in rural areas. So specific human rights related to maternal mortality, of course, one will be the right to life and survival. Why women, if a woman is allowed to die as a result of pregnancy or childbirth, then the right to life is said to have been violated. In many parts of Africa, when a woman is pregnant and is expected to give birth, people are looking, are very expectant in terms of celebrating, rejoicing with the woman because she's bringing forth another life. But unfortunately, it has become a very risky affair in Africa for a woman to get pregnant to the extent that people are very apprehensive what will come out or what will become of that woman at the end of the day. And that's why the risk of a woman dying from pregnancy in many African countries, we have it as the highest in many African countries, as low as 10 or 12 or 8 in the countries like Niger, like Chad. It means that for every pregnant 8 women, that one is likely to result in death. And that's very, very high. In that regard. So it's also a violation of the right to health of women, right to health and reproductive health care if they die during pregnancy, right to non-discrimination and equality. I've raised that the dynamics about discrimination and inequality in terms of maternal health, looking at the types of women that are often predisposed to death. It could be women in rural areas, it could be women, young women who were given out early in child marriage. So the right to dignity is also violated as a sort of maternal death. And sometimes, given the trauma, the difficulty, the human rights abuses women go through, from the hands of healthcare providers, we said that it amounts to violation of their right to be free from torture, inhuman, and degrading treatment. One of the recent development occurrences in Africa has to do with what is known as obstetric violence. This is where healthcare providers, treat women with insult, abuse their rights, refuse to attend or provide care, as a result of or due to the reason that they are unable to afford the fees, charged for them. So this is a very, very serious issue which has to undermine women's right to not only to dignity, but also to be free from inhuman and degrading treatment. And with some court decisions, especially from Kenya, we've seen 1 or 2 cases where the court has affirmed that detaining a woman as a result of inability to afford to pay maternal fees, will amount to inhuman, degrading treatment. Also, right of information, some people don't have enough information, especially when we talk about adolescents and young women. And that's also make it very difficult them to know the right thing to do. So in terms of the human rights approach that has been applied to maternal mortality, one of the important ones has to do with the technical guidance that was adopted in 2011 by the Human Rights Council. As we know, the Human Rights Council is the highest human rights organ of the UN. It adopted the technical guidance for states to guide them in adopting a right-based approach to maternal mortalities. And some of the important elements of the technical guidance has to do that the need for states to involve women when developing policies, programs relating to maternal mortality or maternal health. Women, especially marginalized groups, should be involved in the decision-making process. So the right to participation, very important, was highlighted in that technical guidance. The technical guidance also highlights very important about budgeting and planning, that it is not enough for government to adopt a programs policy, but this must be properly funded. Resources are required in order to address maternal mortality. And implementation in practice is also very important, that in some countries, we know that their policies are there, the laws are there, but implementation also becomes problematic. And so the technical guidance emphasizes the need of states not only to effectively implement laws and policies that could save women's lives, and then more importantly, accountability. Government should be able to account for whatever it is. And the various organs of government, including the parliament, should play an important role in holding governments accountable, the executive, looking at the budget of the Department of Health. What have they been doing in order to address maternal mortality? Are those measures or steps sufficient to address maternal mortality? It's also urges states to develop laws and policies that will ensure safe motherhood. And one of the areas which the technical guidance emphasizes has to do with removing gender inequality in every society, trying to laws that undermine women's rights to equality should be removed, and practices, cultural practices that also may affect women's health may also be addressed as a way of ensuring safe motherhood. And other human rights committee or human rights organ body that has also addressed maternal mortality will be the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in its General Comment 14 and General Comment 22. General Comment 14 is seen as the guiding principles to realizing the right to health. It's the committee adopted that General Comment in 2000, and it expatiates what the right to health means and what we expect states to do in order to realize the right to health. The committee adjusts what is known as the 3 A's and Q's, that the right to health must be available in times of sufficient in quantity, including in rural areas. Accessibility, it must be accessible to all, and there are about 4 elements of accessibility. One is physical accessibility, particularly for women in rural areas. Healthcare clinics should not be too far away from them so that they can go for antenatal, and also where there is a crisis in terms of during pregnancy, they could easily go to somewhere they can get treatment. Economic accessibility has to do with cost of treatment. Many women complain that because of this time, they can't afford transportation to go to seek antenatal. So that's also state needs to make sure that they find a way of assisting such women. And even for doing a childbirth, if they need to pay anything, that government can waive if they're unable to afford that. Information accessibility is also part of it, that people need information. Without information, people can't enjoy good health. And the last one has to do with non-discrimination, which is a very important element of the right to health, which I also mentioned earlier. Then acceptability means that it must be culturally and ethically acceptable, particularly the role of healthcare provider, how they treat women when they attend antenatal, or when they want to at the time of childbirth. They must treat women with respect in line with medical ethics, as the case may be. And of course, quality has to do with availability of infrastructure facility in many healthcare facilities, particularly those in rural area. The facilities are not there enough to, so that when women need treatment or experience complications, they are unable to get the necessary treatment or help they require. It urges states to also prioritize access to care services for vulnerable and marginalized groups, particularly women, women with disability, women living with HIV, refugees, and asylum seekers, so that when they seek for antenatal, when they go for childbirth, and then they must be treated like every other person with dignity and like a human being. And then they also have the CEDAW committee adopted General Recommendation 24, specifically dealing with the right to health of women. And the committee expects that states has the obligation to ensure that there's a certain particular treatment that are, that only women that need that kind of treatment. One of those is pregnancy. Men don't get pregnant, so it's only women that get pregnant. So to that extent, states are expected to do the necessary, put necessary measures in place to ensure that women don't die during childbirth, as this case may be. And coming to the African section, attempts has also been made by the African.
I'm so sorry. I know that you were patiently agreed to be last, yeah, but you have utilized all of your 20 minutes, I promise you. But we have now officially run out of time for this whole session. We are in actual fact already more than 20 minutes over the time. So unfortunately, I am going to have to be rude and interject and stop you there. Melody has indicated that we have to call this session to a close because they need to prepare for the next session. You are more than welcome to please share your presentation also in the chat so that people can see the rest of the information that I have now prevented you from sharing with everyone. My sincere apologies for that. Colleagues, we have sadly run out of time and there is no more time for questions, but note that the questions that have been posed have been answered in the question and answer box already. So for now, it remains for me to say thank you very much to all the presenters and to all the attendees, and of course to the Office of the DVC for organizing this research week. I need to also bring your attention to the fact that the next session will start at 12 o'clock, and that will be presentations from the DVC Research and Innovation Support Units. So please also support them. And again, to all our presenters, unfortunately, no more time for questions, but I'm sure that if anybody really is interested, they can contact the organizers and they will be able to get in touch with you. Thank you very much again for your attendance. Melody, over to you.
Thank you, Prof.